Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back through the mists of time. As the modern world fades away around you, I invite you to settle in, find a comfortable position, and allow your mind to wander with me into the shadows of history. Tonight, we'll explore the fascinating and sometimes unsettling world of medieval folklore, where the boundary between reality and imagination grew thin in the twilight hours. This tale is crafted especially to help you unwind, to quiet your busy thoughts, and perhaps to guide you gently toward peaceful slumber as we walk together through the forgotten pathways of the past. The medieval world awaits us with its mysteries and whispered stories. I'm always curious to know where in our vast world you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling in for the evening, or maybe it's the quiet hours of early morning where you are. Leave a comment sharing your location and what time of day you're joining our historical journey. I love seeing how our community gathers from across the globe to share these moments of calm reflection. If you find yourself drawn to these soothing historical narratives, consider subscribing so you won't miss future tales from centuries past. Each story offers a new opportunity to escape the present and find respite in the rich tapestry of human history. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital distractions of our modern age. Close your eyes if you wish, and allow your imagination to carry you back to a time when the world was lit only by fire, when the forest edge marked the boundary between the known and the unknown, and when the stories people told in hushed voices shaped their understanding of the world around them. The village of Thornfield awakened with the first pale light of dawn, as it had done every day for generations uncounted. Smoke began to rise from thatched roofs as cooking fires were kindled, and the soft lowing of cattle mingled with the distant crow of roosters announcing the new day. Men and women emerged from humble dwellings, their faces weathered by sun and wind, their hands already reaching for the tools that would carry them through another day of labor in the year of our Lord, 1236. In the communal fields that surrounded the village, a dozen peasants bent their backs to the soil, working in companionable silence as the morning mist clung to the ground around their ankles. "My grandmother always said the mist hides the little folk," whispered Edith to her neighbor, as they planted seed potatoes in the freshly turned earth. "She claimed they steal your shadow if you work alone in the fog." The older woman beside her made a quick sign of the cross, her eyes darting toward the forest that loomed dark and impenetrable beyond the cultivated land. "Speak not of such things so close to the trees," she murmured, her gnarled fingers working faster. "The forest has ears, and names have power." Not far from where they worked, the village blacksmith hammered rhythmically at his forge, each strike sending sparks dancing into the air like tiny fireflies. Children darted between the cottages, collecting eggs and feeding chickens, their high voices carrying across the morning air. Yet even in their play, they gave the forest edge a wide berth, for they had been raised on tales of what lurked beyond the protection of hearth and home. "Stay where the church bell can be heard," mothers warned their young ones, "for creatures that fear God's voice cannot tread where its echo reaches." Agnes, a young woman of perhaps 20 summers, moved with purpose along the edge of the village, her woven basket already half filled with early spring herbs. Unlike most villagers, she approached the forest without obvious fear, though the careful observer might notice how she whispered prayers under her breath as she worked. Her knowledge of plants and their healing properties had earned her both respect and wary glances from her neighbors. "The fever broke last night," called out a grateful mother from a nearby cottage doorway. "Your willow bark tea worked just as you said it would." Agnes smiled and nodded, her fingers never ceasing their careful selection of tender green shoots emerging from the awakening earth. As the sun climbed higher, Agnes ventured closer to the tree line than most would dare. Here grew the most potent herbs, nourished by the deep shadows and ancient soil of the forest margin. The villagers needed her remedies, especially with summer sickness approaching. yet they would cross themselves when speaking of how boldly she walked the boundary between safety and peril. "I need just a little more comfrey for Thomas's broken arm," she murmured to herself, pushing slightly deeper into the dappled shadows beneath the first great oaks. The forest seemed to hold its breath around her. Birds that had been singing fell suddenly silent, and the air grew noticeably cooler against her skin. Agnes paused, her hand frozen above a patch of the plant she sought. Something had changed in the quality of the light filtering through the leaves. It seemed to dance and shift in ways that sunlight should not. A soft, melodic sound reached her ears, like voices singing in a language she had never heard, rising and falling in impossible harmony. The sound came from deeper within the forest, where the trees grew so thick that daylight barely penetrated. For a moment, Agnes felt an inexplicable longing to follow those voices, to see what made such beautiful music in the forbidden depths. A twig snapped loudly behind her, breaking the spell. Agnes whirled around to find Father Cedric, the village priest, standing at the edge of the clearing. "Agnes," he said firmly, his face grave beneath his tonsured head. "You venture too close to the old stones. Come away now." She blinked, suddenly aware that she had wandered farther than intended, nearly reaching a circle of moss-covered megaliths that the villagers avoided even in daylight. With trembling hands, she gathered her basket and hurried back toward the priest, the strange music fading behind her like a half-remembered dream. As evening approached, the villagers gathered in the common house, a large wooden structure at the center of Thornfield. Here they would share the day's news, settle disputes, and pass the dangerous hours of darkness in the safety of numbers and firelight. Children sat wide-eyed as old Willem, the village elder whose memory stretched back farther than anyone else's, took his customary place near the central hearth. "Tell us about the wild hunt, Willem," called one of the younger men, earning himself sharp looks from mothers with small children. "The nights grow shorter now, but darkness still has power." Willem's rheumy eyes reflected the dancing flames as he leaned forward on his walking stick. "The hunt rides when the moon is dark," he began, his voice surprisingly strong for one so bent with age. "They come with the storm winds, with hounds whose eyes burn like coals and riders who were once men but now serve powers older than the stones themselves." The room grew hushed as he spoke, even the smallest children sensing the weight of ancient fear in his words. "They hunt for souls, for those foolish enough to wander alone when the night belongs to them. If you hear the baying of their hounds, cover your eyes and pray, for to look upon the hunt is to be marked as their prey." Agnes sat quietly in a corner, her fingers working a piece of embroidery, though her eyes remained fixed on Willem. She had heard these stories all her life, yet tonight they seemed to touch something deeper within her, after what she had experienced at the forest's edge. "And what of the fair folk, Willem?" asked a young mother, clutching her infant closer to her breast. "The ones who take our children and leave changelings in their place?" The old man's face grew even more solemn. "They walk among the ancient trees, appearing beautiful to mortal eyes, though their hearts know no human kindness. They hunger for the innocence of children, for they have none of their own." His gnarled finger pointed toward the sleeping infant. "They slip through shutters left unblessed, past doors without iron nails. They take the fairest babes and leave behind creatures of wood and leaves that only seem to be your child. By the time you notice the hollow eyes and strange appetite, your true child has forgotten its mortal name." A heavy silence fell over the gathering, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft whimpers of children pressing closer to their parents. Outside, the wind had risen, causing the wooden walls to creak and moan like something alive. Someone began to sing a hymn, and others joined in, their voices forming a shield of faith against the darkness beyond the walls. Agnes found herself watching the shadows cast by the fire, remembering the strange lights she had seen among the trees. wondering if the old stories held more truth than the educated priests from the city would admit. The following morning, a commotion at the village gate drew curious onlookers. A traveling monk had arrived, his brown robes dusty from the road, a wooden crucifix hanging prominently around his neck. Brother Thomas, as he introduced himself, was welcomed by Father Cedric with the customary offering of bread and salt. "The Lord has guided me to share his word with your community," the monk announced, his voice carrying across the gathering crowd. That evening, villagers packed the small church, bodies pressed together on rough wooden benches, eager to hear the visitors' tales from distant lands. Agnes found a place near the back, watching as Brother Thomas stood before the altar, his gaunt face illuminated by dozens of tallow candles. "I have walked through valleys where demons whisper to the weak of heart," Brother Thomas began, his eyes gleaming with fervor. "In a village not unlike yours, I met a man who scoffed at confession, who mocked the sacraments. 3 nights later, his wife found him speaking in tongues, his body contorted, his eyes black as coal." The monk's voice dropped to a whisper, forcing the villagers to lean forward. The demon inside him knew things no mortal could know, spoke of secrets long buried. It took 7 days of prayer and fasting before the creature released its grip. Children clutched their mother's skirts while men made the sign of the cross. Agnes noticed how old Willem nodded knowingly, as though the monk merely confirmed what he had always suspected. Brother Thomas continued through the night, weaving tales of saints who battled dark forces with nothing but faith and prayer. "St. Dunstan," he recounted, "caught the devil himself by the nose with red-hot tongs when the evil one came disguised as a beautiful woman." A nervous laughter rippled through the congregation. "And blessed St. Margaret, swallowed whole by Satan in the form of a dragon, burst forth from its belly unharmed when her cross touched the beast's insides." For each horror, the monk offered a remedy: prayers to specific saints, rituals of protection, signs to recognize those who might be in league with darkness. Agnes watched the faces around her transform with each story, fear and wonder mingling in equal measure. 2 days after the monk's departure, Agnes accompanied Father Cedric to the Lord's castle, carrying herbs requested by the lady for her still room. The contrast between village and castle life always struck Agnes. Stone walls instead of wooden ones, tapestries instead of bare surfaces, servants moving silently through corridors. Yet as they waited in the great hall, Agnes noticed something curious. Carved into the underside of the Lord's chair were the same protective symbols that villagers etched onto their doorposts. Above the massive fireplace hung not only the Lord's coat of arms, but also, partially hidden behind it, a bundle of rowan and hawthorn, folk charms against evil that the church officially discouraged. "The lady has been troubled by nightmares," whispered a serving woman to Father Cedric as she led them upstairs. "She sees the wild hunt from her window, though my lord insists 'tis only the wind." In the lady's chamber, Agnes discovered more evidence of superstition. Silver mirrors positioned to reflect evil, back upon itself, small pouches of herbs sewn into bedding, and a costly illuminated prayer book open to prayers against nocturnal visitations. The noble woman, dressed in fine wool and silk, clutched Agnes's hands with the same desperation Agnes had seen in village mothers protecting their children. "Tell me true," she whispered. "Do your remedies keep the darkness at bay?" Summer faded into autumn, and the harvest fell woefully short. Fields that should have yielded bounty produced withered grain and blighted vegetables. The Lord demanded his usual tribute nonetheless, leaving little for the villagers to survive the coming winter. "This is no natural failing," muttered old Willem as the village council gathered in the tavern. "Something has poisoned the land." Eyes turned to Widow Thatcher, who had argued with half the village over her wandering goats. Others mentioned the strange herbs Agnes collected, questioning whether she had angered the forest spirits. And what of Martin the miller? Someone suggested. His grain stores seem fuller than they ought, given the poor harvest. Whispers of witchcraft spread through Thornfield like creeping frost. Children were kept indoors after dark, not just from fear of the forest, but from fear of neighbors. Agnes found fewer people seeking her remedies, doors that once opened warmly, now remaining firmly shut. They found a witch mark on Widow Thatcher's shoulder, Eliza the baker's wife told Agnes, in hushed tones at the well. A third nipple, they say, where she feeds her familiar. Agnes remembered the birthmark she had treated with salve when the widow had fallen ill last winter. Nothing more than a mole, yet now transformed by fear into evidence of dark pacts. Father Cedric attempted to calm the growing hysteria, reminding his flock that failed harvests were trials, sent by God, not the work of neighbors. Yet even he seemed affected by the mood, performing more blessings than usual, distributing holy water to anxious parishioners. Agnes noticed how villagers now walked in groups, how conversation stopped when certain people approached, how accusations were veiled but ever present. My cow gave no milk after Rose the weaver looked at her, one farmer declared publicly after Sunday Mass. Rose, a widow who kept to herself, found a dead raven on her doorstep the next morning, a warning that needed no explanation. As the first snow dusted the thatched roofs of Thornfield, Agnes stood at her cottage window, watching villagers hurry past with downcast eyes and hushed voices. The forest beyond seemed less threatening now than the village itself, where monsters no longer lurked in shadow, but potentially in every familiar face. She touched the small pouch of protective herbs at her neck, not because she believed in their power, but because being seen without such precautions had become dangerous in itself. The boundaries between known and unknown had shifted. The monsters were no longer beyond the village gate, but possibly within it, wearing the faces of neighbors, friends, and family. The snow continued to fall as Agnes wrapped her woolen cloak tighter and ventured toward the edge of the village, where a small cottage stood apart from the others. Smoke curled from its chimney in a thin, gray ribbon against the white sky. This was the home of Widow Edith, a woman who had lived through the village's previous bout of witch accusations some 20 years prior. The villagers still kept their distance, but they no longer crossed themselves when passing her dwelling as they once had. Agnes knocked softly on the weathered door, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "I've been expecting someone," came a voice from within, followed by the sound of a wooden latch being lifted. The door creaked open to reveal a woman with silver hair braided simply down her back, her face lined with age but her eyes sharp and clear. "Come in, child, before you freeze to the spot." Agnes stepped into the warmth of the small cottage, where bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters and a pot bubbled over the hearth fire. The scent of rosemary and sage filled the air. "You've come about the accusations, haven't you?" Widow Edith asked, gesturing for Agnes to sit on a three-legged stool near the fire. "History repeats itself in Thornfield with the predictability of the seasons." "I don't understand why this happens," Agnes said, accepting a cup of steaming liquid that smelled of mint and honey. "Why do we turn on each other when times grow difficult?" Widow Edith settled into her chair, her gnarled hands resting on her lap. "What they call witchcraft, child, is often nothing more than knowledge, knowledge that keeps us alive." She pointed to the bundles hanging above them. "These herbs that heal fevers? Once a woman could be burned for knowing which plants draw out poison or ease a difficult birth. The tales of forest spirits that make children fear wandering too far? They keep little ones from falling into bogs or eating deadly berries." Outside, Agnes could hear children's voices rising in a sing-song chant. Through the small window, she saw a group of village children forming a circle in the snow, playing at some game despite the cold. "Even now, look at them," Widow Edith said, following her gaze. Playing at wild hunt they are, learning without knowing it. Agnes watched as one child wore a crown of twisted branches, playing the role of the hunt's leader, while others pretended to flee. They're learning to hide, to run, to work together, the old woman explained. The same skills they would need if raiders came or wolves descended from the hills during a harsh winter. The monsters in our tales have always served a purpose beyond mere fright. The children's game shifted, and now they were enacting the story of a changeling child, with one small girl pretending to fall ill while another took her place. See how they learned to recognize sickness, Widow Edith observed. To watch for changes in behavior that might signal fever or plague. The changeling tales teach vigilance, teach mothers to notice when something is amiss with their babes. Agnes sipped her tea thoughtfully. Father Cedric speaks against these old beliefs, calls them pagan superstitions. Widow Edith's laugh was like dry leaves rustling. And yet the good father hangs rowan branches above the church door at midsummer, does he not? Blesses the fields at planting time, just as the old ones did? She shook her head. The church came to our lands, but our lands changed the church too. The saints who battle demons are not so different from the old heroes who fought monsters. St. Brigid's cross is hung to protect homes just as elder signs once were. The old woman rose with some difficulty and moved to a small wooden chest in the corner. From it, she withdrew a carved figure, half rotted with age, of a woman with an animal's head. My grandmother's mother kept this hidden when the first priest came. A goddess of the forest, she called it. Now look here. She reached for something on a shelf, a small wooden figure of Saint Agnes, with a lamb. Different faces for the same wisdom. Respect the wild places. Care for the vulnerable creatures. Remember that life and death turn in a wheel. Agnes studied both figures, seeing the similarities, despite their differences. So the monsters, the wild hunt, the changelings, the forest spirits, they're not just stories to frighten us. They are stories that kept us alive, child, Widow Edith said firmly. Tales that taught boundaries, where not to go, what not to eat, whom not to trust. And when the church came with its saints and demons, we simply wove them into what we already knew. She gestured toward the window, where the children now gathered around an older boy who was drawing something in the snow with a stick, a protective symbol that blended the cross with much older signs. Look how naturally they combine the old and new. Children understand what many adults forget, that these stories help us make sense of a world filled with very real dangers. As twilight approached, Agnes helped the old woman prepare a simple meal of barley soup. The real danger, Widow Edith said as they ate, comes when we forget why the stories exist, when we fear the monster more than what it represents. Your neighbors aren't turning on each other because of demons or witches, but because of hunger and uncertainty. The failed harvest is the true monster, not Widow Thatcher or Martin the Miller. Agnes nodded slowly. So how do we remind them? How do we stop this before someone is truly hurt? The old woman reached across the table and patted Agnes's hand. You must help them see that the boundary between known and unknown isn't where they think. The forest isn't our enemy. It gives us food, medicine, and shelter. And our neighbors aren't our enemies either, even when they seem strange or different. She smiled sadly. The old tales and the new faith both teach us this, if we listen carefully. The monsters we should truly fear are ignorance, hatred, and fear itself. As Agnes prepared to leave, Widow Edith pressed a small bundle into her hands. Herbs for protection, not from witches, but from the sickness that comes with winter. Share them. Teach others their use. Knowledge shared is the best protection against fear. Walking back through the falling snow, Agnes passed the village church where Father Cedric was lighting candles for evening prayers. Through the open door, she could see the painted saints on the walls. Saint George slaying his dragon, Saint Margaret emerging from the belly of a beast. Ancient monster tales clothed in new garments, teaching the same lessons of courage and perseverance that villagers had whispered around fires for countless generations.